All right, my name's Drew Daniels. I'm the cinematographer of Outer Range, and this is the Go Creative Show.
Hello and welcome to the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. My name is Ben Consoli, and today we speak with Drew Daniels, the cinematographer of Outer Range on Amazon Prime. Drew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I love this show. This is like the perfect blend to me of science fiction, but also rooted in reality, and it's very human, and it looks amazing. And this is definitely like if there's ever been a show that really hits me perfectly, this is one of those shows, and I just cannot wait to talk to you about it. Before we get there, I just want to very quickly remind all of you listening today to subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, because if you're just listening to us right now, you're kind of missing half the show. So that's sort of the whole thing, especially here at Go Creative Show. We are a visual medium. We are an audience of people that make things for visual mediums. So why not subscribe to the YouTube so you can see and hear everything going on Go Creative Show? All these interviews, you get to see our guests. We post our full interviews and also show shorts that are enhanced with behind-the-scenes photos and videos, so it is the place to be. Of course, when you do, make sure that you subscribe to us and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Of course, all things Go Creative Show at gocreativeshow.com. So, Drew, Outer Range, Amazon Prime, such a cool project. How did you first get involved with this?
Yeah, just honestly, I'm not the biggest sci-fi person, but this felt like something I could actually wrap my head around. Felt like something up my alley.
Yeah, and I think that for me, because I wouldn't consider myself a science fiction fan, but I like stories that have like little science fiction elements in it, but are largely just dramas and very human stories. Like I don't like it when shows pull me out of reality too much. I can handle a little bit, but when I get pulled out too much, I start becoming like, because I'm thinking like if anything can happen, then anything can happen. And it sort of is like, there's no consequences. Are people alive? Are they dead? Who knows? Who cares? This show doesn't really do that. This show is very much rooted in reality. And I think the visuals support that as well. So like when you hear about this project, Outer Range, coming in, sci-fi Western, not so much sci-fi, a little bit more of the humanistic look, humanistic story. Visually, when you start thinking about it, what are your first thoughts?
Well, I think my first thoughts were, to ground it in reality, grounded in like a just realism with the lighting and things. I feel like you're saying, the audience can then invest more in the story and invest more in the characters and the stakes, and it doesn't feel like. I think when things just feel real, like you feel more invested, and I think it helps just ground a story like this. I think that was one thing. It needed to feel grounded, and then you could play with the visuals. You can play with the show definitely goes there in terms of like getting weird and getting just kind of crazy with like the camera movements and the lensing and just the overall aesthetics of it. But as far as like the sci-fi elements, I was thinking more along the lines of like Twin Peaks or like Solaris or something, where it just feels like you're mostly into like the characters and the humanity of it. The whole sci-fi thing, I mean, you could see it or not see it. I think it's more exciting when you don't see it. It's kind of this thing with horror as well. It's like you don't see the creature or the thing. You see what it does to people. And I thought that was an interesting thing about the scripts and also just about like the approach to it.
I know that you did episode 3, 4, 7, and 8. So that's basically half the show. Mm-hmm. You're working with other cinematographers. Talk to me about that collaboration and who you worked with.
Yeah, so I was there pretty much from the beginning with Adam Newport-Berra, who is a really good friend of mine. And, we shared an office. We hang out on the weekends. And we both had a very similar, I mean, we have different tastes, I think, but we both really did have a very similar approach to the show. And, we would dig up references. We would try to like come up with ideas to pitch to the showrunners and to Amazon as far as like the the aspect ratio of the show, the lensing, all of those things. We didn't win all the battles, but we were definitely like collaborating pretty hard on it. We would reference the same films and contribute to like, we'd go on scouts together. We would, it was about as collaborative, I think, as it could be. I've done a show before. I did Euphoria, and I wasn't there in the same capacity as far as like, they had already shot a pilot, and I was kind of just like matching that. But with this, I got to be there from the beginning, and it was really, really satisfying, and I felt like my mark was left on it, even in the beginning, the episodes that I didn't shoot.
Part of now that's an interesting take, because leaving your mark on a show is not something that cinematographers necessarily get the opportunity to do all the time, because they're working under a show Bible, they're working under a primary DP. You can't really deviate too much from the established look of a show, especially multiple seasons into a series.
Yeah. I do agree with that, but I think with this show, one thing that I had always wanted for this show was I wanted it to kind of have a progression, and I wanted the language to be able to have somewhere to go. So I feel like in some ways the first 2 episodes are a little bit more, I'd say like maybe a little more stoic, a little bit more grounded, a little slower. And then things like really have a place to go. Then, by 7 and 8, we're like just crazy. We're doing dolly zooms and big crane shots and car chases. And it's, the whole thing just, because of the beginning, it had a place to go. And I like to do that with all the things I shoot, is I like to have a visual progression and really commit to it. So
what would you say?
I was able to do that in some way on this.
What would you say was your stamp? So like, what was the Drew Daniels of it all that sort of came in on your first episode 3?
I don't know. I mean, that's a really hard question to answer. It's like, so much of it is dictated also by the director you're working with. Like, I will say that the director of 7 and 8 really let me like run with it. So I would say my stamp is more on 7 and 8 than anything. Those feel like very much like my visual style and my like almost like sense of humor, even like with the camera. Like I really think like me and Larry, director of 7 and 8, we really had a very similar idea about like shooting scenes in the fewest shots as possible, like in the most economical way, and like really committing ourselves to, all right, we're going to shoot only these 3 shots, and you can really only edit the scene one way, because it goes from this shot to this shot to this shot. And I would say that's more my visual stamp. So like it really came out in 7 and 8. On 3 and 4, the director, she was much more, she would cover her back and shoot a lot more coverage, and so like I can only do so much, and I tried to leave my mark on it. And in one way I will say I got to really leave my mark on the show with the lighting. And that was kind of a little bit new for me, because I wasn't operating, and I would sit with the gaffer and the DIT, and we would like really get in there and shape the light and really like have a concept for the lighting. And every shot we would do something. We would really finesse every single frame and get it really, to a place that I'm one of the things I'm the most proud of on the show is like my lighting. And I think it's because of that, actually.
You brought up something interesting just a minute ago when you were explaining this about not about providing shooting limited amounts of shots, so not necessarily getting the traditional coverage that one may expect. Talk to me about that decision and how that impacts the entire show, because you are essentially, when you're given less options to the editor, you, I'm guessing, it allows you to have more time to do what you want to do. Like, what's the trade-off there?
Well, I think one of the things it allows for, or just by nature, is like it gives me and the director control over the edit, and therefore control over the show. Like in a really just, I mean, it's risky, but I think that's my preference, is to shoot the show and bake the look in and bake the cut in the way you shoot it on the set, on the day. Because like that's where it's really made. I mean, yeah, that's like that's a whole nother thing. It's like prep versus shooting. But as far as the shooting of it, like, yeah, I get to me and the director get to like really leave our mark on it by the coverage, by the specificity of the shots, and we talk about the editing on set. So it's not like something we're just leaving, hoping that it'll work. We're like, no, this scene opens with this shot. We ended the last scene with this wide frame, so let's start on this close up. Let's pull out. Let's pan over. So we really, I mean, when you shoot a shot like that, there's no B camera. There's no covering your back, really, because it would mess up the entire like rhythm of the cutting. So, we're thinking about rhythm, we're thinking about story, we're thinking about composition and juxtaposition of shots. We think about all those things and on set, and then we execute it. And it's just like, that's how you leave your mark on the show, I think.
Now, you'd mentioned that being risky. Mm-hmm. Why do you say that?
Oh, I mean, because, you get a call from the studio like, you're not getting enough coverage constantly. I mean, that's a big thing that I constantly hear. But, I mean, enough coverage for one person might be like, for us, it's like, oh, it's a good thing. For them, it's like, oh, we need options. We need options. And I totally understand that. And I think that there are scenes, you just kind of have to know when to do that and when not to do that, when to cover a scene heavily and when to just commit to your 1 or 2 or 3 shots, So
is that a common thing that happens? Like, do cinematographers always kind of want to have a little bit more control over the edit by way of limiting the amount of shots? Is that like kind of a common tug of war between studio and DPs?
I think it is, yeah. I think so. I think it's also directors too. Sometimes directors will be very much on your side with that. But sometimes a lot of it comes down to like, do we run a B camera every single shot? And I say no. Usually I'm like, no, it doesn't, we don't need it. It doesn't work. But sometimes it's great. It's like, yeah, that's a great option to have that extra shot or that extra angle. Or maybe it's something that's like really a little bit more weird and avant-garde, and you want to just have them try it. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, if it's like a punctuation mark for the scene, that's cool. If it doesn't make the edit, I'm fine with that. But yeah, I do think it is a constant thing that you have to battle. And I think part of it, the tricky thing with TV is you sign on as a cinematographer, you sign on to a whole project, and you don't really know who your director is going to be. Most of the time you don't. And that for me is the biggest risk because I'm just working with a director I've never worked with before. I don't know their style. I don't know if they're going to try to make me shoot the thing in a way that I don't want to shoot it, or the way that I don't think is right for the show, or they'll make me do a bunch of extra coverage, or et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think it is a constant battle as far in a lot of different ways, not just with the studio, but sometimes it's with directors that you don't know who want to shoot it in a different way than you want to shoot it. But a lot of directors will kind of defer to you because you've been there longer. You've shot you've developed the show. You've shot 2 episodes already, whatever it may be. But yeah, it's a battle.
Talk to me about this concept of having a sense of humor in your cinematography. You brought that up a few minutes ago when I was asking you about what was your stamp on the show. That was one of the things you mentioned, and I'd love to get a little bit more elaboration on that because that's an interesting idea to me, and I want to make sure I'm understanding it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I would almost say it's like a personality. The camera has a personality. It always does. I feel like no matter what you do, like you suggest a shot to the director, it's going to have your like ideology, your understanding of the world, your sense of humor, all those things in it. And I like shots that have a little bit of like levity to them, a little tongue in cheek, a little. I mean, I think it stems back to not only my personality, but just, like the photography that I like. There's always something where you, in a frame, I like frames with different layers and frames where you see different things happening in different depths. And also like there's comedy in there, like, like Elliot Erwitt or even like Cartier-Bresson or something. He has a sense of humor with his photography. You see, like when that frame was taken, he was trying to make the audience laugh. He saw something funny and decided to take a picture of it because it just piqued. Like, oh, that's interesting. I think what I find interesting in the world is like, yeah, like the comedy or the total like dichotomies and things that just really like clash and things like that,
Is there a particular scene or shot that you can reference here that sort of had that, maybe that tongue-in-cheek feel, or there was a little bit of comedy infused into it? I'm sure it's been a while since you were filming the show, so it might not be top of mind, but is there anything you can reference?
Oh, I mean, like this scene. I think it's in 107 and in 108 there were several scenes with Billy and Autumn, and there's one at the motel where
I knew it. I knew that was going to come up.
Oh man, like I love that scene, and I love the way it's shot, and we did this sort of cut where you literally like do a big shot and then repeat the shot. And then, like for instance, they kiss and we do this super fast dolly shot. And then we do it as a crane shot. And then we do it as like an extreme close up of their lips and tongue. And it's all backlit. And it's just like, it's over the top, but there's something to it that's a little just funny. And also like the opening of the scene starts and it cranes through the window and goes over Autumn and reveals Billy just standing there at his truck. And I feel like you just can't help but laugh, just even like his posture leaning against the truck and the way the camera reveals him, it's just ridiculous and funny. There's also this shot at the end where they kiss in the bank and he starts singing and the camera booms up and looks down at him and the light is hitting his face in a certain way and he looks up towards the camera and sings, and I don't know, just stuff like that. It's like, oh, we just thought, oh, this would be funny.
The singing shots are so silly. Like this character, you don't know if it should be menacing or funny, or like you really don't know what to make of these singing shots.
Yeah.
I'm trying. What episode was the one where he's singing in the mirror and he's just standing in his underwear with no shirt on? I can't remember if that's 2 or 3, but
that was episode 2. But I actually shot that.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Well, that's another good example. It's like, yeah, we start close on him. I mean, I remember I was even talking to Adam. I was like, oh, Adam, I'm gonna do a zoom out for that shot. He's like, of course you're gonna do a zoom out. That's the only way to shoot that shot. It's like, yeah, you start on his face and he's singing and that's interesting, but then you pull out and see him in his underwear It's also like I liked it because it felt like it might be Royal's sort of point of view in a way because it was a zoom and it wasn't a dolly shot, you know?
Yeah.
So to me, it felt like those kind of shots, like for instance, zooms or long lenses or something. It feels like an other point of view. It's like it adds another layer to the point of view, which I always try to think about when shooting something is whose point of view is this?
Let's talk about the camera package, lenses you chose, and why. And I want to sort of morph that into a discussion about camera movement overall, because this show has a lot of unique camera movements and evolves from the first episode to the last. It gets more adventurous, it gets more jagged, it gets more sort of all over the place, which I love because it's really a great visual evolution of the whole show. But let's start with the camera and lens package that you chose. So tell me what you used and why.
We used Alexa Mini LFs, and it's funny. You choose something, and then you're like, I should have done this. I should have done that.
You have regrets about it?
Honestly, one of the biggest things that me and Adam actually were both advocating for is we wanted to shoot the show in a taller aspect ratio, like 1.5 to 1. And we ended up 2:4. We literally ended up on the opposite because because of the showrunner. So they wanted a widescreen show, and I get that. I just thought that the whole sci-fi thing would have played very interestingly in a tall frame. But that aside, we chose Panavision because there's a Panavision in New Mexico, and I mean it just kind of made sense, for the show. For the support that we would get from Panavision. We shot on Panaspeeds. One of the main reasons is because they're large format. They cover the sensor, and also they're very fast. And particularly Adam really wanted to shoot a lot of things very wide open. And I actually started to gravitate away from that as the show evolves. And I thought it was a personal choice just because I actually don't like super shallow depth of field, but it also felt like a choice that made sense for the story as it evolved, having more depth and starting in a much more shallow, I think it kind of, it almost feels claustrophobic sometimes when you have depth of field that's that shallow. So yeah. I thought things would open up as the show kind of moved along, and so that was both a personal choice and just our personal preference, but also it kind of made sense for the story. So I kind of justified it that way, which happens sometimes a lot, actually.
You must have also needed those high-speed lenses for how dark some of the cinematography is. I mean, you guys go really, really dark in a lot of these shots.
Yeah, I will say, though, a lot of those shots, we probably had ND filters in to get and then shoot it wide open. I mean, we had a lot of light. There was no shortage of big lights on that show. And, shooting night for night on wide, expansive fields and out, the ranch house and just everything you had to light to get a realistic looking shot actually is kind of crazy. But yeah, we shot at 1600 ISO, and we shot on the Panaspeed. So in theory, you could shoot it with a lot of natural light, but we didn't. We mostly we lit everything. And that was a choice to really be able to control the look of the show. And, I don't, and it's funny, I don't shoot everything like that. I actually do like shooting natural light, and I do like very, very minimalist setups. But for this show, it just felt like it needed something more. It needed to be a little bit more deliberate,
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the lighting in Outer Range. You had mentioned earlier in the episode that it was one of the ways that you really left your mark on the show. And talk to me about why. What were some of the things that you were doing in the lighting that were uniquely yours and also fit the show?
Yeah, Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say uniquely mine because I definitely stole a lot from Roger Deakins.
I guess we all steal from everybody at the same time, but still, it's your interpretation.
Yeah. It was actually really interesting, the whole Roger Deakins thing, I will say, because Roger Deakins shoots a lot in New Mexico, or at least he shot several films in New Mexico back to back, like Sicario, No Country for Old Men, True Grit. Anyway, so and on top of that, he's friends with Josh Brolin. Shot No Country for Old Men in Las Vegas, New Mexico, the exact town we were shooting in. So there would be times where Josh would be like, "Oh, we literally shot on this street a similar scene, a shootout scene or whatever on the same street." He's like, "I'm having some very intense deja vu." So, we had to make it feel different than No Country for Old Men, which I think we did. But in some ways, like I feel like my lighting philosophy is probably not all that different from what Roger Deakins does. It's like, side light, backlight, trying to motivate with real sources you see on screen. But I really got to do this thing that I wanted to do. That actually Roger does, is where like you motivate the light from outside, through windows mostly, and then you just wrap the key light around with like a series of bounces and smaller lights. And you don't really use fill light, or you don't use any fill light. If anything, take away fill light, and you just wrap the key around. And usually the key comes from further from the side, or from like a three-quarter side or back angle. And then you wrap it with, say for instance, 3 4x4 muslin bounces or ultra flop bounces or something. And then, in that wrapping, you use 3 different lights. So you can control like how it wraps. For instance, as it wraps to the front of the face, it dims down, or you scrim it down, and you also flood the light. Maybe the side one is spotted in, it's a little hotter, and then by the time it gets here, it's dimmed down and it has a really natural fall off on a person's face. And it also is an eye light depending on where you put the camera, but most of the time the camera will be in an angle to where just the key light is, or the wrap light, the light that's wrapping is the eye light. So it kind of I got to really like hone that in and like figure out ways to take that sort of just easy, like very basic concept and apply it to a lot of different scenes and really just make the light look natural and motivated, which it was. But then just really like hone in the details of like how it falls off around a person's face. Like I got to really study faces and incorporate the lighting in a way that I hadn't really gotten to do because I hadn't had like the time, the resources. I had a really good gaffer, Jeremy Oliver, and his team was fast. And they just, once we started doing it, they just knew like, oh, this is what we're going to be doing. So had all the stuff ready, we really became a pretty well-oiled machine.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding. You're lighting through windows for the general ambience of the space, and then your key light is essentially a bounce of a side or a backlight.
Yeah.
That's right? Okay.
Yeah. You're wrapping around the light. That's basically what you do. You take the light, you do the broad strokes. Sometimes the broad strokes are enough and you're like, all right, this is great. But often, you make the broad strokes, and by the time you set your exposure, you need a little bit of light to wrap around the face. And that's basically what we were doing with smaller bounces and smaller lights.
Now, you have a lot of shots inside the farmhouse. There's plenty of windows there for you to work with. But then the scenes that I want to discuss, and we'll talk about the house too, but there's a lot of shots inside of bars. And, it's darker. There's not a lot of windows. Or even if there are, it's nighttime, so nothing's coming through. So really you're working with, neon beer signs and just lights that are in there. And as a result, you have a lot of color and a lot of pretty deep saturation in some of these nighttime shots, both inside and outside.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about the way that you are incorporating the lights that are on set, like the practicals that are just there that you have to kind of work with?
Yeah, for sure. So a couple things. I mean, we worked with the production designer pretty heavily. Like this color neon here. I need lights behind. On the other side of the bar. And I don't know if you remember, but they had this huge array of like small little warm lights and a mirror. So we kind of had the amount of control and budget to build sets and to that was a set that was actually built on Main Street in the town, and we did day for night there, and it depended on the shot, but mostly we were able to do day for night, and for the day scenes I was able to just blast light through those windows because a lot of the references were just like, I remember the showrunner saying, I want it to be dark inside, but when you open the door I want it to be like blinding, like I just want this big wash of light to be able to come in, when it feels like you've been in a bar all day and someone walks in and it's just like, your eyes are so adjusted to the dark that the light just becomes too blinding. So, took that and ran with it, and we designed the set with dark colors, and so a lot of it is like just being able to collaborate with a production designer. We all got the same influences from the showrunner, from the writer, and so we were all on the same page. Another part of it, though, is our references. Like me and Adam, we're both like very much obsessed with like Robbie Mueller, amazing cinematographer, who shot like Paris, Texas, and he shot The American Friend, a lot of Wim Wenders movies, and No Time to Live and Die in L.A., Barfly. Anyway, so like his work was a big influence in the color of the show. Like we didn't want the show to be like desaturated. We didn't want it to be tinted warm or tinted, we wanted to like play it natural, but like have saturated rich colors, like very like poppy reds and blues that were just really intense and strong. So, and Ernst Haas was also another photographer who some of his work in the US was just like stunning and was a big influence on like driving scenes, bar scenes, rodeo scenes. Alex Webb is always a huge inspiration for me, and his work is always very saturated and deep shadows. So it's a combination of a lot of different things to get where we got.
Ernst Haas.
Yeah, Haas.
That name is not familiar. I'm going to put this. Oh, no, I don't think this guy's familiar. I will put some links to Robbie Mueller and Ernst Haas in the show notes so you guys can check it out. But no, I'm not familiar with his work, but I'm looking at photos now and I can see that there really is, he's leaning into color quite a bit and a lot of like natural color, cityscapes and lights outside and playing a lot with kind of like the when the shutter is open too long and you sort of have the streaks and everything.
I think it was for us more about like playing the natural world against the unnatural world. With, for instance, like an orange sodium vapor barn light or a green mercury vapor light against like a beautiful sunset, or like a wide, expansive prairie or something, things like that. Like like to me, like juxtapositions like that are always very interesting. And I did this movie Red Rocket right before Outer Range, and it was all that. It was like oil refineries and green and orange and crazy messed up colors of light against like the most beautiful sunsets you've ever seen. So those are things that are just interest me. And I think, for instance, in a photograph or a frame, just a frame of a beautiful sunset. Sure, we've all seen that, but a beautiful sunset with something in the foreground that just throws it and makes you, like an ugly green light silhouetting like a cowboy, smoking a cigarette or something. Like that's more interesting than just the cowboy against the backlit beautiful sunset that we've all seen. So
let's talk about camera motion and camera movement in Outer Range. What was your strategy for it? I feel like, as a viewer watching it, it seems like we have more and more of it as the series progresses, or as the season progresses rather. And it seems like like the biggest camera motion near the beginning of the season is kind of these very rigid, slow to medium dolly moves in and out. And you're starting to like just wet the palate a little bit about what's to come with the motion. And over time, it gets more aggressive. Over time, it gets, more, I guess, fast paced. So talk to me about the strategy of camera motion, how you use it, and what were your kind of thoughts throughout this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on, with like the sort of like contemplative nature of the first episode, and like things are just starting to move, and like the whole is just starting to like create these sort of or maybe exacerbate certain emotions and feelings and dynamics between families and within families. And so yeah, it makes sense for it to be slower. And then I think 3 to 3, 4, 5, and 6 kind of, I think they're very different, but like they kind of take that further and further, and the camera starts to be a little bit more like an active participant in the storytelling. I think the camera does have this sort of omniscience in some way. To me, like there was some times where like in 7 and 8, like I feel like we really got to a point where we're like, oh, this camera feels like it's almost like the whole's point of view. Like this camera is inspired by something otherworldly, like maybe it was a zoom, or maybe it was like some big push in or some like really dramatic thing that it was doing. But I think we did try to have a certain sort of camera language for more like family dynamics things, and then things that were like whole dynamic, which then start to intertwine in a way. But because there was that sort of like I think omniscience is the best way to put it, where like the camera just feels like it's motivated by something that you can't even articulate, I think it was the whole, it was just like this greater perspective. And then and then I think as far as camera movement, I think we'd always talked about not really doing handheld, but then by the time me and Larry got to episode 8, we're talking about the rodeo, and we're talking about, I think there were several reasons for going handheld, but for us, it just felt like this. That's the way it needed to be. Yeah, and and we had these influences for the rodeo, and it just felt like we were never going to be able to pull it off unless we were handheld, unless we were fast, and unless the camera could like react to the actors emotionally and like really get in there close. And if we were shooting all that stuff on like cranes and Steadicam, I don't think we would have pulled it off. One of the biggest things that we were able to achieve with the rodeo, for instance, is like shooting dusk for like a very extent. I mean, there was like 6 pages or something set at dusk, maybe even more. And so basically, I talked to the ADs. I was like, listen, the only way we're going to do this is because we had 3 days at the rodeo for 8, maybe even 4. But I basically said we need to shoot over 3 dusks, and we need to spend 1 dusk shooting the opening, him getting there. We need to shoot another dusk shooting the dialogue scene on the bleachers, and then we need to shoot the 3rd dusk where Royal gets the phone call with Autumn and is like walking through the whole thing, and the camera goes around him. Yeah. And I think I'm not sure I think that one might have been Steadicam though, because we did kind of mix in. We didn't want to be handheld for all of it, but for like all of the dramatic, like really nitty gritty stuff, we were handheld. And oh, and also when Royal goes and tries to talk to Rhett, you know, that was all handheld, and that was all dusk. I mean, we got away with like when you read that in a script, you know, you're just like, there's no way you can do it. Or you're like, oh, the only way that we can do this is if we shoot over 3 or 4 dusks, which we were able to do. And which, you know, when you're shooting that fast, you know, you only have like 20, 30 minutes of like true dusk to really nail the shots. You know, we pushed it to the extreme, you know, starting as early as we could get away with and going into like pure dark for some of the shots and, you know, hoping that you wouldn't notice it. And I think we pulled it off, but yeah, it was very satisfying to be able to do that. And I think that that's kind of like, as far as the camera language of it, it felt like things were all clashing and had devolved into this like chaos, and it felt like that moment made sense.
Those rodeo scenes are just so cool, and you do, you know, they appear throughout the entire series, but the rodeo scenes in the final episodes are just, they're just spectacular, because it seems like with each new rodeo scene, it gets elevated a little bit. It becomes, you know, more important in the story, but also just it takes up more time in the episode. It becomes a larger presence in the scene. Yeah. A lot is going on in these rodeo scenes. And I'd love to just round out our conversation with a little bit more of the way that you approach those. I found them to be pretty unique. And I also feel like that the lighting in those rodeo scenes becomes more and more as if there's a spotlight, if that makes any sense. Like the light sources seem to get hotter. They seem to get brighter. They seem to be a little bit more influential in the scene as the rodeo scenes sort of progress over the series.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, a lot of that is the location, because I think when you do shoot in a big scene like that's covers so much space, you kind of have to rely on like what's there in a bigger way, or else you're just kind of fighting what's natural, you know, and I think you can really screw yourself when you try to fight the available light too much. So it's funny you say that, because we actually lit the first scenes more because it was a different location, and it just wasn't as good of a location, to be honest. And it didn't have like, I don't know, there was something about the last one, episode 8 rodeo, where it was a circular shape. It had like lights all on one side, and I was able to control them in like such a great way, where like if I was looking this way, all of the lights were on, pointing right at me, and I could turn off the lights on this side, so everything was like silhouette-y and really, really, really backlit heavily, and I would let the lights bloom, and it was all the lights and the lenses doing all of that like blooming, and it was just a matter of like taking what was there and controlling it. And it was honestly like, it was our approach to the scenes, but also it was like a little bit of luck and a little bit of like just everything kind of aligning, you know, which I think is half of the cinematographer's challenge, is just like creating those scenarios where you can be lucky, or where things just come together just perfectly, because you're flexible enough, you plan it just enough, and you also let enough chaos happen. I think the chaos is very important,
especially with a rodeo scene. I mean, talk about chaos. You don't know what the hell's going to happen. And
yeah.
So and like, what were some of the challenges that you faced just working with, I mean, I'm sure that I'm guessing that you had a double in for our main characters, especially in the wide shots, but I mean, there must be some just unpredictability to the whole thing.
Yeah, but like I actually really thrive on like unpredictability, like, and things not being perfect. Just in general, like I always try to, I don't know, like I always try to like inject just a little bit of like unpredictability or chaos back into the thing that we have totally set up perfectly, or like the perfectly composed shot or the perfectly timed out shot. It's like, I feel like there has to be a little messiness to it, a little something that makes it feel real and like wild, and unpredictable. And the rodeo was a perfect example of that. And I think I had three. I probably even had 4 cameras for some of those days, just because like I knew that we had to capture that sort of like that unpredictable nature and that volatility and the energy of the rodeo. And it just felt like the whole rodeo felt like a beast, and it felt like learning from the first 2. Handheld was just the way to do it, and emotionally also just the way to do it as well for what was happening in the story.
Yeah. Well, the show is called Outer Range. It's so great. It looks amazing. I know anybody listening to this show is certainly going to like it. And really appreciate the cinematography in it for sure. All of the episodes on season 1 are there, and I strongly suggest you guys check it out because it is awesome. Drew, thank you so much for being on Go Creative Show.
Cool, thank you. I really had a good time.
All right, I want to thank Drew Daniels, the cinematographer of Outer Range, for coming on the show and talking to us all about it. It's such a good show, you guys. You absolutely have to check it out. Outer Range on Amazon Prime. I also want to tell you about Connor Crosby. He produces the show. You can find him at ignitionvisuals.com. And Dave Siegel from Siegel Sound. Dave mixes and masters and makes the show sound so good. Find him at siegelsound.com. Of course, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, where we post exclusive content like show shorts and some behind-the-scenes imagery and all sorts of stuff for each episode. All things Go Creative Show at gocreativeshow.com. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Ben Consoli, at BenConsoli. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next week on another episode of the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.